You know that moment right before an orchestra is about to start playing? There's that clamor and commotion of sound as the musicians bring their instruments into tune. As an orchestra director in the spring of 2020, that's the sound that filled each of my days. The noise of youth, but also the noise of becoming. Until one day we were no longer becoming because the noise had all stopped. And as I walked into my orchestra classroom, there was no clamor and there was no commotion. There was simply a sea of empty black boxes staring back at me on a computer screen, waiting for me to tell them how to make music when the world had gone quiet. And my main form of communication with them was a 2x2 Google Meet chat box. Now, I'm not here today to tell you about how music teachers kept being music teachers in the era of Zoom education. The long story short of it, I learned to adapt, and the students learned how to adapt, and we all just, adapted. But I am here today to tell you about how I discovered unexpected musicians and rediscovered how music has the power to draw beauty out of the silence and unexpected sources. It's about how music education is so much more than the notes and rhythms on a page, and it's about how these new musicians teach me every day more than I will ever teach them and completely redefine success for a program. But sometimes it takes the world going quiet for us to hear the new voices. I first discovered one of these new voices when I was on one of my pandemic adaptations routines. I would routinely go through the halls of the school and walk because, full disclosure, I had been hired at this high school right at the beginning of our year of online learning, so I never met any of the students in person. One day on one of these walks, let's be honest, waddles, I was extremely pregnant at the time. The silence I'd become accustomed to was shattered by the voices of our CAPB students who were coming back to school. Now, CAPB is a short term we use to describe students in our Category B special education department, or students who have significant or severe developmental disabilities, many of them having limited verbal communication or are nonverbal altogether. These students typically aren't in your mainstream general education classrooms, and they're not an elective like orchestra typically. But I heard of one or two CAPB orchestras popping up around the country, and as I listened to their voices fill the halls with the sounds of becoming again, I thought to myself, well, there's no better time than to start our own. After weeks of talking to teachers, administrators, parents, we were ready to begin. But as I sat there waiting for them to come down the hall to my classroom, I started thinking to myself, what on earth are you doing? You're not a special education teacher. You don't know anything about their individual diagnosis, their adaptations. You know nothing. I've grown up in the United States my entire life, where I think we tend to view success as this never-growing ladder climb. And failure isn't falling down to the bottom of that ladder. No, failure is often seen as a simple slip of the foot. And so as I was waiting for those students to come down, I was worried about the slip of my foot. But I took a chance, and because of that, I can bring to you today not my story, but the story of three others, Dean, Max, and Kevin, who all in their own unique ways showed me that success is not this ever-treacherous ladder climb. No, success is simply doing something that you haven't done before. And it's the joy in that which we should celebrate. Meet Dean. Now, many would underestimate Dean at first. Dean is in a wheelchair, he is nonverbal, and falls asleep often in class. But Dean completely redefined what success meant to me. Music can come from anyone, anywhere. You just have to be willing to give them a voice. To give you a little bit of idea of the scope and sequence of my orchestra class, I started off with these squares of gauzy fabric called music movement scarves, where the students learned how to follow different symbols I put on the board. And I would give them egg shakers, which are like maracas and egg forms, where they learned how to start and stop sound together. Now, unlike the other CAPB students who were very excited to show off their music scarf compositions, Dean was not into it, and he dropped the egg shaker and would just watch it roll away. I brought out these cardboard instruments next for the kids where they got to experiment with how to get their instrument out of the locker, how to take care of something nice, and how to not injure the instrument at all. But Dean quickly sent that one sailing across the room when he was in need of a break. Things weren't going super well, but I reached into my teacher tool belt and I brought out a familiar tool, one that we all know, the sticky note. And I drew different symbols that we were learning on there, and I created a word wall for Dean, which he uses to help communicate. And with this word wall, he's able to identify 100% of the time if sounds are high or low, fast or slow, and various music notation. Emboldened by Dean's engagement, I decided to take the next step and bring out a real instrument for him. After all, success does not happen without a chance. And so I took out a violin, I strapped it to a music stand, and I took all the strings off but one. And when we opened that case, we found Dean's Success. He's awake, he's engaged, he's excited to get his instrument out of the locker and hold it tight in his lap. He's plucking along with his peers and reading music notation. Thinking about Dean's success and what he was working on, I thought back to when I was teaching fully online with my gen ed students. I remember I didn't know any of them at all, and so I'd ask them questions on their homework assignments to try to get an idea of who they were. And so I asked them one day, do you identify as a musician? And most of them said no, because I'm not very good. And I realized in that moment that we were failing as music educators if that's what they thought being a musician was. Classical music is becoming this increasingly inaccessible art form reserved only for those who can purchase a symphony ticket, wear black tie, and sit quiet for entirely too long. But it wasn't always this way. Like chamber music, for example, used to just be when people would get together and anyone would pick any line of music with any instrument and jam. There wasn't this hard line of right or wrong. And because of this, most students don't feel worthy of the title of being a musician. They're much more likely to identify as a student athlete or a math whiz than a musician. And I think that's because music is so hard to quantify. There's no regularly scheduled next game or math test to ace. The joy and the meaning cannot come simply from the end result. It has to come from the progress we make when we are musicking. Musicking being the act of making music. Musicking is not new to any of us. We can all music, and we all still can music. Every child walks around humming their own little made-up tunes, and many of you actually probably still do today, whether you're singing in the shower or driving along in the car and humming to the radio or tapping a pencil. But because this pencil tapping and shower singing isn't a part of a string quartet, we forget that we can and we do all music. And this is what the Cat B students remind us to slow down and appreciate. And this is what the Cat B students remind us music teachers what we're actually trying to teach. Dean is musicking when he's plucking along to a beat with his peers and engaging those fine motor skills. His success is hearing the highs and lows, fast and slows, and engaging with me in the creation of sound. Success looks different for Dean. It looks different for everyone. Meet Max. Max puts a smile on my face every day he's in my orchestra classroom. He routinely comes in and sits crisscross in his chair and mirrors everything I do with a grin and a wave. But while Max was always happy to be in my orchestra classroom, he needed someone sitting next to him at all time, prompting him to follow each step, each instruction, even though he definitely knew the materials. Until one day he got up on his own and he went and got his instrument and unpacked it without a single prompt from us, all while knocking music stands over in his path. Many people ask me, what pieces are these Cat B students working on in class? And I understand the impulse to think that there has to be this greater end goal where they put on this polished, perfected piece at the end of the year. And while they are performing with their gen ed peers on stage in May, that's not what Cat B music is, nor what it's for. It's about the musicking. It's about the in-betweens. And Max shows us what those in-betweens look like. These students are practicing those fine and gross motor skills with their individually modified instruments. They're practicing reading these multi-step symbols and following multi-step instructions, just like they would have to learn how to read a stop sign or learn instructions on how to do a job. And they learn to do so independently. Through Cat B Orchestra, Max earned confidence. Max found his voice in the same way that Dean did, plucking along and engaging with his peers on a level that they had never done before. And these are the same lessons that are being taught every day to every student in every music classroom. Being a musician looks different for Max, and it looks different for everyone. Meet Kevin. Now, when Kevin first entered my classroom, let me tell you, he was not having it. He did not like the fact that his routine had been thrown off. He was scowling. He was not ready for the day. So I brought out the instruments to introduce them to everybody, and I started playing them. And when I got to the cello, Kevin's eyes grew wide, and he started saying, "Me!" So I said, okay, well, why not? And I gave him the cello, and he ripped the bow out of my hand, and he started bowing back and forth. And this student, he's usually so sensitive to new sounds, tilted his ear to the cello, and his eyes started tearing up with tears of joy. Now, Kevin reminds us that music is unique because it meets every person where they're at. It is individual to them, as long as you're willing to be brave enough to experience discomfort and be vulnerable to the process. Musicking is one of our great equalizers. We can all engage in the sacrifice to hear each of the notes, and we can all create, even if our creations are different. It makes us human. Kevin's cello has changed what every day will look like for him. When students age out of the CAPE program at the age of 22, they're either moved on to post-secondary services to continue to work on life skills, or they transition to a career center where they can start working towards the workforce. Kevin's family was told it was probably best for him to continue working on post-secondary services. But at the end of the school year when he graduates, we're working for a way for him to come back as my instructional assistant and have the chance for an independent job he was originally told was not the best fit for him. Kevin's music education journey looks different for him, and music education should be for everyone. We're back to complete in-person learning this year, and thankfully, and we're working with our students, and I asked them to help me create a recruitment video for our rising ninth grade students. And I asked them to pick a word that reminded them of orchestra. And not a single student chose a single word that had anything to do with Beethoven or tone production or how they just love playing scales. But instead, they said memorable. They said exciting. They said a stress reliever. They said family. And these are the same in our culture. And these answers give me hope that we're doing something right again as music educators, because we're teaching musicking. As a society, we must reconfigure how we define success. And our music education classroom is a sanctuary in the school where this work is already happening. Our classrooms are where students are taught perseverance and how to sit with the discomfort of not being good at something right away. Something as a culture I don't think we're willing to accept a lot of the times. Our classrooms are where the in-betweens come to life and are celebrated, as long as we're willing to slow down and be a part of the musicking. And these answers are the same for the CAPE students. I asked Kevin one day how playing his cello was going, and his answer had nothing to do about the new note he had just learned how to play. But instead, he said, "I feel happy." Thank you.